Welcome to Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. Our podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? What can we learn from them? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. We have just a fascinating conversation today with a wonderful industry peer. Craig, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Michael, it's so nice to be with you. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Friends, you're going to love this one. Make sure to be generous and, of course, share this because that's how the industry both grows and we can all learn and advance together. And, of course, if you haven't done so already, please like the podcast and subscribe. Craig, everybody wants to know, were you born this way or how did you get into the appraisal and valuation profession?
Well, Michael, I'd like to say I was born this way, but like most of us, we have to start somewhere. And, it was interesting because as a kid, my dad taught school, but he was a bricklayer. And I kind of came up through the construction side, had run a little masonry company, was working in masonry ever since I was a kid.
Yes.
And in 1979, I got married, and my father-in-law was a real estate broker.
Oh. And
I discovered that I was a crappy salesman. I couldn't.
Thank goodness you find out what you're not good at early.
Yeah, well, it's as important to know what you can't do as it is to know what you can. And
sure.
So he had a guy working for him who was doing real estate appraisal, and of course, in 1979, up through almost 1989, there was no real licensing path that was required. Mm-hmm. And so I had met this guy, and he had divorced and had remarried and was planning to move to Seattle from Provo, Utah.
Yeah.
Seattle at the time was a big Boeing, Boeing was in its heyday, and he was moving up to Seattle to do some real estate appraisal work up there, and I was going to appraise or buy his real estate appraisal business. He was going to introduce me to all of his clients, and you'll appreciate this. The world has changed a little bit since then.
A little.
And the FHA appraisal form was one page.
Oh, yeah.
The top half of the form was a little bit of property information, and the bottom half was cobbled together 3 comparable sales. And then the back side of the second page was a couple of Polaroid pictures that you'd stick on there. And that was the appraisal. And I think at the time he was getting like $95 for FHA appraisal. Mm-hmm. And we complain about fees, but I mean, it was a different world, and the requirements were quite a bit different. But I was pretty excited to come in and start doing this. And so I had an appointment to meet with him. This was maybe in the early 80s. And so I go to meet with Steve to make the arrangements, and he doesn't show up. And I'm thinking, what happened? This is kind of frustrating. And so, what's up with this? Well, I find out the next day that his stepson, who was like 18 years old, had got his hands on a .22 pistol.
Jeez.
Got his stepdad, shot him in the head, killed him, stole his Mercedes, and drove to Vegas. And my dream of having, my dream of starting my professional appraisal career was pretty well dashed. And
oh my God,
it was a sad, I was pretty disappointed, and trying to figure out now what am I going to do, and the problem is there was not a clear track to get into the appraisal profession at that time. I mean, you had, people would go work at a bank and work as a staff appraiser, or you'd work with the highway department or maybe an assessor's department. But, it's the old process of nobody wanted to hire you if you didn't have experience.
Yes.
But how do you get the experience? And so I was going to the university and had a lot of classes on economics and finance and all this stuff. And
sure.
And was talking to a guy, and he says, listen, just hang a shingle out. There's no licensing. Just hang a shingle out, call yourself an appraiser, and see what you can get, which is what I did. And it turned out I mean, in time, it worked out okay. But boy, it was hard to figure out how to get into the profession. And of course, about almost end of the 80s is when we had the savings and loan crash. They decided that we ought to start licensing appraisers, and we went through that process. But I'd been appraising full time for 5 or 6 years by then, and so it's just a matter of taking a class taking a test, and you're now a certified general appraiser. So it was kind of a interesting process. But I think the thing that we look at the challenges we face in the business today, and getting people in is still a challenge. It's just different than it used to be.
It's a different set of obstacles, but boy, there's still obstacles.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, but yeah, that's my unusual entrance into the appraisal profession, is just kind of making it up as you go along after your dreams are dashed.
I just want to say that I appreciate that you were such a good maker-upper, that you have sustained yourself for all these years once you got through that rough start. Oh my goodness. So you get that opportunity, and I think this is helpful because some people don't know what it was like to know that it's 2024, and now many people are hearing this in 2025, but it was the prior century, which sounds like forever ago, but it really wasn't. And we look at it and say, in the middle of that prior century, so not even 100 years ago, like these things didn't exist. Barely 50 years ago, as you're pointing out, that the environment that we know today didn't exist. Like it really is still that new.
Yeah, there has been so much transition. I was speaking at a conference in Mississippi a couple of days ago, and the topic I was speaking on was, how do we as professional appraisers remain relevant in the current changing landscape of valuation? Yeah. And one of the things that we had that I talked about in the presentation was the changes that have happened for appraisers over the last 40 years. Yeah. And it's significant. I remember when we first started using digital cameras, they looked like binoculars. Yeah. And you take a picture, and because we were spending $700 a month processing film. Yeah. You'd go take your little 35 millimeter cameras out, and you'd take the pictures, and then you'd have to take 3 pictures of everything, so there'd be enough room on the negative that you could get them processed. And then we had a full-time employee that would just manage these stinking negatives so that you could get the photos processed and put on the appraisals. And PDF was, the concept of a PDF was science fiction. Everybody got a hard copy of everything, and it was just things have changed a lot.
Yeah, it is a world of change as it comes through that. How did from when you started, it sounds like you might have started residentially or commercially, or were you kind of a generalist?
Pretty much generally. I had done a little bit in both. And honestly, Michael, we were crappy at all of it. But I think everybody was kind of crappy at all of it.
Come on, no one is born great. Unless you're like a savant and you do but aside from that, like everybody else, that you suck, and then you learn that you're not so good, but then you continue to work on it and you get better over time. And if you stay with it over a period of time, you develop some competency and some capability, and you stick with it further. You move, from competency towards a level of excellence and or mastery. But you can't do that on social media, like boom, 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 like a couple clicks and you're there. Like that takes long-term investment, and you got to get good over time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the key characteristic for appraisers at whatever stage you are in your career is the desire to learn and become better. I think if you have a desire to learn and to become better, eventually you'll become a master at whatever it is you do. And I remember back in the 80s reading an article that somebody had put in the one of the trade publications, the Appraisal Journal, I believe. Yeah. And they were talking about this relationship between land size and how the market responds to this. And And computers were not really a prominent thing at that point. I mean, they were there, but most people didn't use them. But he was making the case that land size follows a logarithmic curve. Okay. And that each time the property would double in size, there was some kind of a percentage factor that the price per unit would change. And I remember going in and getting a little statistical modeling program and go in and try to model it to see if I could get the same results. And this was back in the 80s, and my phone would do a better job of it than my computer did now. But I've always kind of had an interest in trying to figure out how do things really work.
Yes,
and I think that curiosity is what helps us to become better.
I think that's a great point. It's fascinating because when you look back, like you said, or the guidance that you got, so hey, just go out there and start doing it. How did you get started? Given that you had a couple legs up on people, because I think I recall you saying that your dad was in masonry, so you had some understanding, whether you wanted to or not, about construction and this whole idea of a building doesn't just come together on its own. And you mentioned that you took your hand at real estate sales and found out that you weren't good at it. So you had some exposure to it, but how'd you get going and how'd you learn?
Well, I think a lot of it, I was taking classes at the university on economics and finance and the idea. Originally, I had thought about going into being a asset portfolio manager with stocks, and I decided that they really didn't. It was really hard to become a real asset manager. Usually, you became a stockbroker, which was just another version of a real estate salesman. And so I thought, maybe I don't want to do that. So I basically just tried to position myself and started getting people to give me assignments. And, back then, I mean, word processors were not really a thing. And, we were typing, it's hard for a lot of the folks who started within the last 10 or 15 years to imagine that you're rolling a form into a typewriter and typing out the information onto that form. And heaven forbid you make a typo. It was a different world, and it's been fun to see the requirements from users of appraisal services coming in and saying, guys, we need you to do a better job in supporting your opinions and conclusions. And, we just this couple of days ago, I was with Scott Reuter and Lyle Radke and talking a little bit about appraisal modernization and some of the things that are coming down the road. And I think these things are good because it's kind of requiring us to up our game and be able to have some kind of support and logic for the things that we do, where I had begun initially that was really not a thing.
And that's a very, very good point. I mean, and kudos for you for early on recognizing what you knew. You had a sense that there's things you don't know and you want to go learn it. So you actually took courses along the way. How was it like working in the industry before there was regulation? And then did it change for you once some regulation came into place?
It's been a constant evolution. And I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it seems like the users of appraisal services have kind of driven the boat in terms of the kind of stuff that we do.
Yeah.
And so, as you've had the GSEs, coming in and saying, hey, we need more information than what you're providing, and we need better support for what you're doing. And it seems like every time we've had a financial crisis at a national level, it's kind of reshaped the way some of these things have been done. One of the real things that made me aware, there's two things basically. One is that in the early 2000s, I was put on our state appraisal licensing and certification board and served there for 8 years. And I started seeing a lot of the work that was being sent in as a complaint. And you begin to realize that there's a lot of really substandard work that's being produced out there that has some problems. And the other thing that was interesting is to see the evolution of technologies that have been able to help improve the way that we do things. And so it's been interesting to be involved on the regulatory side as well as on the practicing appraisal side and see the areas where we need to do better.
Well, it's fascinating. And obviously across the country, there's only so many of those boards and so many seats, and most people in the profession will not get an opportunity to serve in that capacity. How did that influence or impact you as an appraiser and specifically as a professional in the industry?
Well, it number one made me not want to have my work turned in.
Couldn't agree more.
But one of the things that I came to appreciate is that one of the best learning experiences that I had was reviewing others' work and becoming more familiar with the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice, how they actually apply in the work that's being developed and reported. Mm-hmm. And I became far more familiar with those standards and why they're there and how they apply. Yes. And prior to that, I was a little ignorant to some of that.
I mean, aren't most of us? It's kind of, I don't know about you, but at some point you might have had to, whether it's take an exam for appraisal or maybe it's take an exam for, a driver's license or what have you. And you can pass the class. That doesn't mean you know all the content in the book, in the manual.
Yeah, in fact, I think at a national level, and that I spent 3 years on the Appraisal Standards Board with the Appraisal Foundation, and that was an eye-opener as well. But the thing that I think we have discovered is that there's a disconnect between the concepts and the application. And our education, I think, as a general rule, has not bridged that very well. Yes. Now you're seeing, as you start taking your USPAP update courses, you're starting to see a lot more of the education more along a case study line, with the idea being that if we can take real world problems, see how they apply, where the deficiencies may be, that we're hoping. I mean, the idea is, the hope, I think, is that the foundation's thinking that it will result in people being able to connect the dots between the concepts and the application.
Couldn't agree with you more. So that was always one of the interesting challenges of taking courses, and still do. It's like, hey, love all the theory and all, but if you don't get an opportunity to really apply it, how good is it?
80% of all businesses fail within 5 years, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. With so many roles and responsibilities that must be managed and have nothing to do with appraisal reports, is it any surprise that it's hard to keep up? Much less having a sense of peace, stability, and profitability that comes from growing your business? Given all of this, you might already be thinking about exiting your business one day. Don't miss the limited opportunity to work with Michael, a real estate expert and professional coach. He has worked with more than 300 owners and entrepreneurs to find their highest and best use by solving problems that reach their most important goals. Compress decades of learning into days by working with Michael. Michael is famous in real estate and business coaching. With his help, you can accelerate your growth, increase your quality of life, and earn more money, all while ultimately doing less. Michael helps you not just grow your business, but also find new purpose in it and in your life. If you're ready to take control instead of being controlled, contact him on LinkedIn or email him at michaelh@paru.com.
I know you've had this experience. You'll go in and you'll take some course and they're trying to show you how to do paired sales, and everything's perfect except for one variable. Anybody can figure that out. It's when you've got 7 or 8 differences in the variables. How do I now deal with the real world in terms of what's really out there in terms of your data? And we're getting some really awesome tools out there that are becoming helpful, but you still got to figure out how to apply logic and judgment into the data that we've got. And so I think AI and some of these things are going to really help appraisers if we can learn how to harness and use it. But it's not without its challenges for sure.
I totally get that. Along the way, one of the interesting opportunities, as you've touched on in many different areas of the industry you've served in, is you kind of go back and reflect on some of those pivotal choices that either you were guided to make or you just said, hey, it seems like a good idea. I'm going to try it, or I'm going to give this a shot. Even going all the way back to getting in the profession, what are a couple of those that come to mind, maybe from a little further back versus till more recently?
One of the things that I realized is that back in the early days, before Dodd-Frank, you really had to market yourself and get to a point where people wanted to use you, and it was hard to do that when if they didn't like your conclusions, they say, well, dude, you don't know what you're doing. Yeah. And so I didn't have a real estate sales license. Even now I don't. Yeah. But they made, I was required to join the National Association of Realtors and the local state and local boards. And I had a buddy says, why don't you run for president of the board? Which I did.
Okay.
And I became the president of the board of realtors in southern Utah, and ultimately became the vice president of the National Association or of the state association, and served on the Real Property Valuation Committee within NAR.
Yes.
And so it provided a network of connections with people and became an education provider for real estate agents and appraisers. And I can tell you that probably one of the best things that we've done is go out and produce relevant education for real estate agents that we are able to present and teach them how appraisers do what they do, demystify some of that. Not everything's a price per square foot.
Yeah.
And it has been an excellent way to generate business from referrals and you become a subject matter expert in their eyes. And it's just been a really useful way to try to market yourself in a world where marketing appraisers is kind of hard.
No, that's fantastic. The whole opportunity to demystify some of the, let's say, misconceptions, to put it simply and mildly. But if you've stepped into that, sometimes we have, and I don't remember the proper terminology for it, but there's that challenge of you don't realize how much you know. And then when you're communicating to other people, you're not even getting back to their level. So stepping into that demystifying appraisal for, in this case, real estate professionals, how basic would you go when you were being of support to them?
Well, one of the things that I usually do when I teach classes for real estate agents is to try to get on speak the same language. Because oftentimes when you're talking with real estate agents, what you think they understand and what they actually understand are different things. And the terminology we use isn't always the same. And so we've come to the point where, and interestingly, appraisers have not been terribly good communicators in some cases.
Yeah.
You may recall, I was teaching at a state convention for the Utah Association of Realtors right after the Home Valuation Code of Conduct came out. And there was a lot of misunderstandings about what that meant. And so I'm teaching this course, and one of the, talking about what kind of communication can an appraiser have with a real estate agent or a property owner and still maintain the appropriate level of communication so that you're not having the so-called undue influence.
Yes. And
so an agent raises his hand. He says, well, I'm confused because I had an appraiser come to a home that he was doing an appraisal on. I told the property owners that they needed to leave so they wouldn't be there, so they wouldn't interact with him while he was doing the appraisal. And he took a little longer than I guess they had anticipated him taking. And so when the property owners come back, the appraiser storms out and, well, I guess you're going to have to go get another appraiser. I've now had contact with the property owner.
Oh, my.
Well, it was, clearly misunderstandings on both sides of the aisle on what that looks like. And I was involved. I was on the appraisal board when this was all coming down. My brother happened to be a state legislator, and I was able to talk him into introducing a priority bill where we were able to regulate appraisal management companies. I think Utah may have been the first state in the country to have an AMC bill put into place. And one of the key components of that was to clarify that appraisers have to get accurate information. And they need to get that accurate information from the sources that have it, like property owners and real estate agents. And we would occasionally have some management companies that would say, well, you can't talk to the broker or to the agent. This was in the early days. Yep. And they would have to come in and filter it and all kinds of crazy things. And so we put it into statute that an AMC could not prohibit an appraiser from talking to those people to get necessary information to complete the assignment credibly. And it was interesting to go through that legislative process just to figure out how it all worked and to get a bill through and so forth. But it was also interesting to see the complexities in trying to craft legislative language that would accomplish the objective and still get passed through both houses and have the governor sign it.
Wow, that's amazing to also get that exposure from the legislative side and actually having an impact in the very existence right there in the market.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas where, as appraisers, we could do a better job. Is that if join a state association, you've got. I think every state's trying. Most states are trying to get a group of appraisers together to try to represent themselves. We have not, as a profession, done a very good job of that. And probably the best mechanism to do that is through your realtor associations. Go create a real property valuation committee within your local group there, because they have the biggest influence at a national level. But the reality for me was the realization that I was shocked at how the appraisal board members were selected in our state. And sometimes people were being selected that maybe shouldn't be.
No.
Hard to believe, I know.
You've got to be kidding me. That doesn't happen.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we've tried really hard to do is to have enough of a relationship with our regulators that we can provide suggestions that can be presented to the governor to participate on that appraisal board. Because if you don't have good appraisal board members, you're going to have problems at a regulatory level for licensing. That's just the reality.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more so on that one. Wow. And, I appreciate you've touched on a couple of these. Any other particular choices you've made along the way that really kind of put you in the path of possibility or prosperity as someone in the profession that, you look back and say, man, I'm glad I did that, because it really gave me a leg up, gave me exposure, opened me up. Otherwise, I would have maybe just kind of been head down and still would have, existed, but wouldn't have thrived necessarily.
Well, and probably the very first thing that I had done is that I had become acquainted with the state regulators, the division director and some of the enforcement people, and had volunteered to help them wherever they needed help. And so the very first exposure I had to that was helping them review appraisals that had been turned in and provide some of the feedback that they needed to get some outside professional judgment and guidance in reviewing some of these appraisal assignments that have been turned into the state. And becoming acquainted with those people and being involved in that process is what really kind of laid the groundwork to being appointed by the governor to serve on the appraisal board, because they knew who we were or knew who I was and had been supportive. And I think many appraisers, it may not be the case in every state, but I believe that most states will allow continuing education if you attend the state appraisal board meetings and if the meeting lasts for more than 2 hours.
Oh,
and so if you go to your state appraisal board meeting, whether it's monthly or quarterly, and you probably need to check with them and see, but I know that the foundation will allow that as continuing education. And frankly, it's some of the best education you get because you're working through, especially if they've got experience review that they're going through, or they've got someone who's having a disciplinary action taken. And there's nothing better than to sit there and watch and see some poor sucker who's getting disciplined and thinking, man, that could be me. If I would like to make sure I understand what I need to do to make my work product a little more resilient when it comes to a critical review.
So it's a good point. And it's one that for all of us that have driven anywhere at any time, especially if we've driven by an accident, sometimes, unfortunately, we've been pretty close to it or only minutes away. And you know that, wow, that could have been me. But, but for the grace of God or for whatever reason, the timing didn't exactly line up. It wasn't, and it is them. So it's a fascinating takeaway about the potential for attending and learning and get the bonus of clocking in some of your continuing education requirements.
Yeah, every state's a little different, but I know most of the states that we're licensed in. I'm licensed in Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, and most of them will have a sign-in sheet. And if the board meeting goes more than, it's interesting because for appraisers, in order for us to get CE, every course has to be at least 2 hours long. We don't have 1 hour CE courses for appraisers, and so, but you may check before you go if you're going with the intention of getting CE. Double check and make sure they're granting it, but most states can and will if invited to do so. And they should if they don't. So,
that's a good point. It's interesting, and I'm sure probably is the case in many markets. But for a while, just for fun and learning, it was like, hey, I was going to go to lunch anyway, and some attorneys that I work with would invite me to their legal continuing education, where routinely there's like a 2 hour kind of lunch and learn opportunity. Just don't see that as much in an industry like this one.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Any other particular, experiences along the way where you're like, hey, I'm glad I chose this because it opened me up or it kept me away from something else?
Well, I think I've been too dumb to realize that some of the things that are hard are actually you learn things from. And so we've gotten involved with some litigation assignments and things like that. And initially, I was really concerned about getting involved as an expert in doing litigation valuation services. And what you discover is that people aren't really any smarter than you are. It's really a matter of just learning how to communicate and how the system works. And there's not, if you understand the process and what you've done and how to do it and can learn how to communicate those things effectively, there's a good, I've learned a lot by being involved as an expert witness in some of these litigation cases. And it's been a very useful and educational process for me.
I definitely appreciate that. What have you observed over your time, of course, from getting into the profession until now, about how things have changed, if they've changed, around bringing somebody else in the profession along? We tend to use the word trainee, which I think is just a freaking terrible term, but that's just my personal input on this. But for supporting newer people coming in, what have you observed differences, or kind of like it's still the same, or is it substantial?
Well, it's been pretty much. I mean, there have been some licensing requirements. Through the AQB has changed the process a little bit, and so we've seen that change a little bit. It was way too easy back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and then as they started to try to rein in some of that, it's made it almost to a point where it's made it really hard to get people in. And we've brought a number of people into the profession. But I think that there's been a real fear, especially on the part of the small appraisal firms, to think, if I bring somebody in, they're going to be my competition.
Yeah.
And certainly that has been the case. But I think that the downfall that you see at a more of a macro level is that trainees are only as good as their trainers.
No, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, isn't that a weird revelation? I mean,
revelation.
You know that, and there's almost like a pedigree. You know, if you, and unfortunately, it seems like in many cases the people who shouldn't train appraisers do, and the ones who don't should. Yes. And as a result, we don't have the level of training that ought to be occurring. And so I think that as the qualifications board has looked at how do we fix the problem, how do we diversify the appraiser community, yes. We've ended up with PARIA, the practical applications of real estate appraisal. And I think it's becoming a very useful alternative track. I'd mentioned to you, Michael, that I'd been working with Melissa Bond on her practicum program, and They've probably have had more success in bringing in a more diverse population of appraisers than just about anything else. And, my son Jeff is working with Security Evaluation. They've brought in quite a few diverse people into the business as trainees. And so it seems like the harder we try to diversify, yes, that a lot of these programs aren't terribly effective. And we're in a particularly difficult circumstance now because demand for appraisal services is a little low because interest rates are high.
Yes.
But I think that it shouldn't be too easy. You should get people that really want to be competent, qualified professionals in the business. But I think we're going to see some improvements over the next little while to where it's going to be easier in the future than it has been in the past.
Well, that's encouraging. That's definitely encouraging. What would you recommend, Craig? I mean, you've seen so many things. You've been involved at so many different levels, which it's wonderful to have that perspective. But if someone like you has been in another industry and coming into this industry, as it is the case for so many, what can they look forward to, or how should they set their expectations to both succeed, but also not undershoot, what I'd call the, professionalism of the industry?
Well, I think most people who aren't appraisers don't have a very realistic view of what appraisers do. I think the general person, the population, the people who have properties appraised, they see the appraiser come out and spend a little while gathering a little information. And then they see them send in a bill for whatever that service was, and they say, wow, they're making a lot of money for what they did, because they're not seeing all of the standard one development work going on in developing these opinions and conclusions. And they generally are just looking at the number, and they're not really paying attention to the type of communication that takes place for developing those things. And so frequently, I think a lot of people think that, you just walk in, you lick your finger, you hold it to the air and say, it's worth $300,000. And it's just my opinion. And they don't realize. And so I think frequently when people start taking a more objective, realistic view of what appraisers do, it becomes a lot more difficult than what they thought it was. And it sometimes weeds some of these folks out because it's not the get rich easy thing that they imagine it to be based on their limited perspective of what they think goes on.
I think that's useful. That's indeed useful, to say the least. Given all that you've been involved in, and as you mentioned, or at least I heard you say, that you're now part of the generational leg of the industry. How was that experience being a parent? And maybe did you rope him in early, or did he go off on his own and kind of come along?
Well, I have two boys that have basically bought me out of the business. So, we did treat appraising as a business rather than And so we've tried to, we've got staff, we've got all kinds of processes put into place. And so it's a business. Yes. But I originally tried my oldest son, Jeff. He's a MAI SRA. He's, doing very well. He just finished his 8 years at the state of Utah's appraiser licensing and certification board. So there's been a little bit of that trading places on some of that. But I originally tried to talk him into being an engineer.
Oh, wow.
And so he's doing,
I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, well, he goes in and starts taking the engineering courses. And after a little while, he comes to me and says, Dad, I just don't see myself doing stresses and loads the rest of my life. I want to get out, and that just doesn't appeal to me. And so they'd helped me since they were kids, but it's been fun to see them come in and take over and do better than me. And so it's been a lot of fun to see that happen. And I'm confident that they'll do a much better job than I ever did. But that's part of the reward of watching your kids come up and take your place.
Yeah, that is a wonderful maxim that so many parents do have, and that is, hey, I want to contribute to you to the extent that I can and that you're willing, but need to support you and empower you so you can go out and do what you can. And I want to see you do better because you get hopefully a better starting point, especially in this case. They're not saying, hey, just go out and hang up your shingle and hope some people say yes.
Hope you can find a job.
Oh, that's something else. Wow. Well, Craig, given everything that you've seen and everything you've heard and everything you've experienced, what are you looking forward to? Or what are you optimistic about over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
Well, I'm unlike some. I'm kind of optimistic. I think that there are some pretty cool options that are being developed that are going to really impact. And I think, Michael, the challenge we're going to have is that in order for appraisers to remain relevant, we have got to learn to use the technology.
Yeah.
Either we have the technology become our servant, or we will become its servant, depending upon the skill set that we develop. It's been interesting to see that I'm told that one of the most popular courses at Harvard are dealing with how to provide instructions to AI to get results that you're looking for.
You take a course at Harvard on how to do that? You can watch a YouTube video.
You can watch a YouTube. Well, yeah, but you don't get that Ivy League kudo for doing that. So,
oh my God, that's funny.
But I've been amazed at what you can do with some of the AI, and obviously it's in its infancy.
Yes,
it can help in so many ways, but there's some real cautionary things that you have to be aware of. I was doing an estate in Arizona that had 6 commercial properties, and these were restricted reports. They were just to step up a basis, so the reporting requirements were not as significant as they could otherwise be. But I was using it to help gather some information about the various communities and what's going on, and it was giving me some pretty good results. And so I thought, I wonder if I ask the AI to go search for comparable sales, and I give it the criteria. Say, I want 4 or 5 comparable sales of office warehouse properties in the Scottsdale area that are between 5,000 and 15,000 square feet, and this and that, and usages, and I want you to give it to me in a table format, and I want the tax ID, the street address, the sales price, the square foot. So I kind of give it the criteria, and I'll be doggone, it did. It gives me this stuff, and I'm going, this is awesome. The only problem was that when I tried to verify the data with the tax ID number, it didn't exist. And it would use street addresses that are there, but they're off by like a number or two.
Oh my gosh.
And so I finally come back to the AI and I go, is this factual information? They go, it goes, oh no, this is just illustrative. And so I'm thinking, wow, this,
no idea.
Well, and that's where I think that it has the potential to be a very useful tool. But you've got to be careful because if you don't tell it specifically what you're doing. Now, on the other hand, you can download data from your MLS and dump it in there and have it do some analytics, and it's pretty good. In fact, I was just screwing around with it one day, and I said, residential appraisers do not write narrative reports very frequently. And we're a little worried because, it's like, I need like a template. How do I do this? Yeah. And so I was doing some estate stuff, and I thought, I'm going to ask my AI to see if it will provide me with a restricted use template and provide me with the information on intended use, intended user, scope of work, give me the certifications and all the stuff, and give me a template. And I'll be doggone if it didn't write up an awesome restricted use template just by giving it those oral commands. And the certification wasn't exactly right, so you can't just rely on it on face value. But man, it's going to be, I think in the future, it's going to be a game changer on being able to help us write and to collect information, to research. I think it's got some real good possibilities. You've just got to be bright enough to know when it's accurate and when it's not, and try, double check your sources. But it's got some real possibilities, I think. That's
encouraging to hear and impressive. If for no other reason than, you have been around the industry for a number of years, and to hear you of interest and actively learning and embracing the use of that technology, as opposed to sometimes we do hear people have been around for some amount of time and they're not interested in that next go, as they say, go around the sun opportunity.
Well, and one of the things that, and maybe you've heard the same thing, but I kind of deal in both sides of the business on both the residential and the commercial. And I've talked to a number. We all know that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are in the middle of appraisal modernization.
Yes.
And that within the next year and a half, you're going to see some of this stuff. In 2025, they're going to be rolling out the beta versions of some of this information that they've been working on for the past 4 or 5 years. And I've been on a committee providing some input on behalf of NAR. And so as we talk to the GSEs, that software providers are actively, involved in trying to figure out how to revise this stuff so they can get it to do what it's supposed to. But I've heard so many of the older guys that are, kind of like in my age or older, and they're going, when this new form comes out, I'm done, and it's unfortunate we kind of think that way because it's not really a form. And, it's just a different way in the way that information is being collected and reported. But I think in the long run, those who are willing to embrace the change and learn to adapt and bring it into some kind of a meaningful use will find the profession, it'll probably thin it down a little bit, but those that are left should be pretty good. I think it'll work out okay.
Greg, I would completely agree with you. I am one of those slightly contrarian views in the industry that say there are more opportunities in the future than less. We just don't always have a sense of how to connect the dots because we don't actually know what's showing up.
One of the things that go try this, Michael, is go ask AI how to do that.
You know what? That's actually, I'll tell you, the more I talk to people, the more people, that sometimes it's like, boy, that's so simple. I'm glad you thought of it because I hadn't spent any time on it. But
it may be crank, but I mean, generally speaking, it usually comes up with some pretty interesting ideas on how to do some of this stuff. So
that is absolutely the case. Wow. Fantastic. Well, Craig, I very much appreciate this time to connect today and catch up and hear some of your experiences and stories that have spanned decades, both prior to licensing and with licensing and the evolution that we're in. We very much appreciate it.
It's been a delight. I always enjoy talking and probably too much, but it's just a lot of fun spending time with you. Thanks, Michael.
Oh, that is definitely the case. Definitely the case. Well, friends, again, thank you so much for joining us here for this episode of Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. And until the next one, go ahead and populate the chat. It's always great to get those thoughtful comments and perspectives because as we share, we all can advance together. Craig, thank you again so much.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Paru Zing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing professional paths and achievements of our beloved guests. Before we go, please subscribe on your listening channel, Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. After you drop a comment below, who is one friend and peer you can generously share this episode with? If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Paru Zing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.